Welcome to the Alcohol-Free Lifestyle Podcast, where you learn to live a life of health, wealth, love, and happiness. I'm James Swanwick. Welcome to King's College at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And today we're going to be talking about the psychology of drinking. Why is it that we drink? Why do we feel so much pressure from people to drink? Why do we feel so awkward when we're communicating to people why we're not drinking? What is going on in our brains that creates so much resistance and awkwardness? Why do we mimic what mum and dad did as it relates to drinking? Today we're going to be finding that out, and I have invited my professor, actually, because I studied social psychology here at the University of Cambridge recently, and Professor Johnny Lawson here was my professor in social psychology. And Professor Lawson is a fellow in psychology and behavioural science at Girton College, and he's also a senior lecturer in psychology at Oxford Brookes University. First of all, welcome, Professor. Great to have you here.
Well, thank you, James. Good to be here.
And just for amusement value, well, what were your impressions of me as a student?
We've only got 45 minutes, I think. We'll leave that for another day.
You said to me before we started recording here that you've been a student of psychology since you were 2 years old. You were somewhat joking.
We all are. I think it's psychology is one of those things where maybe studying it formally at an academic level, maybe you go deeper, maybe you go further, but we're all psychologists.
Yeah. And you, in a professional sense, you've been studying this for how long now?
3 decades.
3 decades, yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
I wanted to open the conversation by asking, why is it that we drinkers feel so awkward about our drinking habits if we identify that it's a problem? Or to ask it a different way, why are we so conscious and worried about what people think about our efforts to either stop drinking or just our drinking habits in general?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think one way of answering that is really to think about the influence that others have across or have on us generally. And I think, given the nature of social life, the ambiguity that is in so many aspects of life, very often we look to others for information. And this might be to guide ourselves in situations that we don't understand. It might be to learn how to behave in new situations. But a number of theorists have talked about the way in which life is, especially social existence, is fundamentally ambiguous. It's very difficult to get things completely right. It's possible to get things completely wrong, but more often we're somewhere in the middle and we seek information from others. For this reason, we are very much open to the influence of other people. If we think about social influence as a psychological concept, the definition actually involves the idea of real or imagined group pressure. And it's one of the few, I think, psychological concepts where built into the definition is this idea that what we're experiencing may be completely imagined. And so we really are talking about wispy influence that can be very powerful, but it's also very slippery. It's very difficult to sort of pin down. And so we're very, I think, primed to seek feedback from others. And that's when we get into, of course, the role of non-verbal communication, these signals that we send each other, and also our tendency sometimes to misunderstand these.
So as an example, if someone has stopped drinking alcohol but they haven't really told people yet, and they have a social group where they catch up for their friends for a brunch on a Sunday, or they go to the bar or the pub to watch football with their friends, and they've stopped drinking alcohol. they have a fear of communicating to their peer group or to their social group that they're no longer drinking alcohol. For fear they may be in some ways ostracized from the tribe. That is a real reptilian brain fear, is it not?
Yeah, and I mean, there are evolutionary psychologists that talk about, when we're wandering around as a tribe, the danger of getting expelled. Obviously, we live in a very different world now, but I think we are still very concerned about what others think of us, because group dynamics is very important. And if we look at the kind of work of some sociologists, social psychologists, they very much focus on the fact that what we want from any kind of social interaction, I mean, there may be specific goals, there may be things that we want, but one of the aims, which is quite important, is that things go smoothly. We're not judged to be in a bad light. And so I think we always have one eye on maintaining that kind of the good interaction, whatever that might be.
Do you think that we tend to overplay the significance of our drinking as it relates to other people? For example, do we go into social situations worrying, oh my goodness, they're going to think I'm an alcoholic, oh my goodness, what are they going to say? Whereas the reality is no one really cares that much. Do you think that's accurate?
I think that's part of it, and I think what we need, what's worth mentioning here is, I guess, the nature of non-verbal communication. Fundamentally, it is ambiguous. Sometimes it can be overt, sometimes it can be very clear, if someone is smiling, if someone is just looking absolutely outraged. But very often it's more about subtle signals. And we send signals to each other, and very often we send more than one signal at once. If you think about, I don't know, a situation where, let's say we've been friends for years, and we see each other, we're meeting up for a coffee, and you say, hey Johnny, how are you today? I say, yeah, I'm okay. And something inside your head is saying, no, I don't think Johnny's okay today. Now, what you are seemingly picking up on is not any clear-cut signal that I'm sending you saying I'm not okay, but maybe an incongruence between the signals that I'm sending. It might be that my words say something, how I say those words says something else, what my face is doing, what my eyes, and you, on some level, you put all of these together and you say, not sure, and then you might ask a question. And I think a lot of non-verbal communication, the signal sending, the signal reception, is like this. It's not clear-cut. We construct meaning. And I think in that sense, we all have our own agendas. We all have a sense of what might be going on and what's important in each other's minds. I think we spoke previously, actually, possibly in class.
Yes.
If you're a good student, you'll remember this.
Yes.
About people perceiving facial expressions in others. And I think I was talking about an example where there was one of the models who did some work in terms of demonstrating facial expressions, happened to be a very attractive individual. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the male participants were actually interpreting that facial signal as either flirtatious or interested. And I think what that indicates is that when faced with a non-verbal signal, we can be very easily skewed by our motivations. In that example, the individuals may have been motivated to interpret that signal in a certain way, and it skewed their interpretation of what's going on. You hear other reports, but of course that's a kind of a motivation in terms of what they want to be signalled. But it can go in the other direction as well. It can be motivated by a fear. Again, I think we spoke previously about individuals who have had personal photos or videos uploaded by, you know, a former partner or something through some deeply unpleasant act. And they report going into a supermarket and looking at what is ultimately someone else's fairly neutral facial expression and thinking they know, they've seen it. So it's the fear that's then skewing the interpretation. And I think the kind of context you're talking about is maybe a similar, but, you know, not as extreme example. If I walk into a context and I fear non-verbal communication that is in some way judging me, chastising me, the nature of non-verbal communication is such that that is what I'm going to perceive, because I'm motivated, I'm skewed in my perception, and I will see that. And the important thing to kind of keep in mind, as with the other example, you know, for me, I walk into that room, drinking, whether I drink or not, is a kind of level 10 issue in terms of importance. And for you, it might be, you know, level 1, level 0. It might be of no importance whatsoever. But of course, humans to a certain extent are egocentric, we're narcissistic. We can understand that other minds are different, but we also, at the same time, are not perfect at this. You know, there might be an individual over there at this party who I think is looking at me in a slightly strange way, and I think she's judging me because I'm not drinking. It might be that she has all sorts of issues to do with, I don't know, disordered eating. And she's looking at me thinking that I'm judging her about how many vol au vents she's just eaten. And, you know, I'm not thinking that in a million years. And so there is this potential, I think, within the kind of cloud of nonverbal communication for so much kind of motivated getting things wrong.
The reality is that we have skewed perception, if I am hearing you correctly. So in the example for my listeners and viewers here, they go into a social situation thinking that everyone thinks that they're an alcoholic, whereas nobody's thinking that. Or they go into a situation and they announce that they're no longer drinking anymore, and people start to go, what? Why not? What's going on? Or you'll be fine, go on. Whereas the reality might be that either A, no one cares, or B, if they care, they don't care to the degree that we think that they care. And that can completely cause us to generate unnecessary stress, anxiety, fear, which might ultimately then drive us to actually continue drinking or return to drinking in that circumstance.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think, you know, there are aspects of life, of social interaction, where things are difficult, they're challenging, they're kind of fear-provoking. And so keeping that in mind, the last thing that we need to be doing is adding to that through our imagined fears.
Yeah, imagined fears. Thank you. That's a great way of putting it. Because many of our fears are imagined fears. Yeah. I wanted to bring up a few famous experiments from famous psychologists over the years, and maybe we can, you know, look at this through a theoretical lens as it relates to someone who might be watching or listening to us now in terms of their relationship with alcohol. Now, in class we studied the work of Sigmund Freud a lot, and I might just ask you to explain his concept of the id, ego, and superego, maybe the pleasure principle and the reality principle as it might relate to someone who's striving to be alcohol-free.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of models, ideas, theories within psychology, we can regard them like a pair of spectacles, a pair of glasses. We could put them on, we're within the theory, and we take a look at the world, we take a look at a process. Some factors, processes might come into sharper focus, and some by definition won't be. So I think to run with that with that thinking that there's no such thing as a perfect pair of glasses. I mean, I like Freud's model of the id, ego, superego. I think it provides a good way of framing conflicts, incongruence, issues that we experience in the mind. I don't know that it offers any particularly useful kind of suggestions in terms of, you know, what we're here discussing today. But certainly within that model, you know, there is the id. It operates according to the pleasure principle. Essentially, I want what I want, and I want it now. And when we're first born, we are pure id. Round about the age of 2, the ego comes into being, this sense of consciousness, the self, the decision maker, in response to understanding that life is not like this. We cannot be pure id. We can't always get what we want. And then later in life, when the ego has become stronger, we start incorporating what Freud talks to about as the superego, which is essentially the kind of framework of norms and values that are passed down to us from parents and culture, so on and so forth. So any ideas that we get about whether, I don't know, drinking, smoking is good or bad, or kind of food habits very often, and beyond that, what our society is giving us. And so what we have from Freud is this kind of idea of, there's me, the ego, I'm kind of restrained by my society. It gives me this framework of norms, expectations, but inside me there is essentially a wanting creature. And some things it's okay for me to want, some things it's less okay. And so that model is really about trying to understand how we negotiate these, at times, oppositional influences. So it's a way of, I think, conceptualizing what's going on. It might be that consciously you want to do a certain thing. There's this voice within you that's saying, okay, but I want this. And you've got your particular social context maybe pushing in a different direction. Using this theory, like I say, I don't think it necessarily gives obvious answers, but I do think it's a useful way of almost visualizing what the different forces are and why in so many situations we feel conflicted.
Yeah. Is it the battle that's going on between the pleasure principle in that moment, I want alcohol, and then the reality principle, which is alcohol is bad for me? Is that the conflict that might be going on in many people?
It could be, or it could be the opposite. It could be I, in this situation, don't want to drink alcohol. However, the norms of this situation, I'm seeing people I know, everyone's got a beer. And so by wanting what I want in this moment, I'm in some way in conflict with the context. So I think we can see the superego, or what the superego is feeding in, as being kind of equally dynamic. It can change from situation to situation. And so even though the conflict's the other way around, we still experience it as a conflict, because there is the mismatch between id and superego context.
I want to move to the social psychologist Solomon Asch, who conducted a series of human behavior tests which became known as the Asch conformity experiments. And Solomon Asch investigated the extent to which social pressure from a majority group could influence a person to conform. So could you just maybe explain those experiments and maybe how that may explain why we drink alcohol because of, say, group pressure, even though we know that it's bad for us?
I mean, it's a classic in social psychology. A very simple task, 3 lines, A, B and C, different lengths, and a target line. And all the participants had to do was say, okay, which one of A, B and C is the same length as the target? In the initial conditions, I think Asch had pretty much tested this among many participants and found that everyone scored at ceiling. The task was so easy, no one got it wrong. And then came the experimental phase, and it was a setup whereby, if you imagine 5 people sitting off to the side of you, and we do this test together. And so there's essentially a bunch of people answering before you answer, and then I answer last.
Got it.
What Asch did, though, was made sure that those people that answer before you are all undercover research assistants.
Yes.
You're the genuine participant. The answer to this particular question is clearly B. First person says A. You're sitting there thinking, this crazy person.
Yeah.
Second person says A. And you're thinking, what's going on here?
Yes.
Third person says A. So the big question is, what will you say?
Yes.
And what Asch found was that about 3/4 of the time, or at least on one trial, people would articulate the wrong answer.
That's amazing. So even though 5 participants are being asked, what's a 1 + 1? And the answer is clearly 2. They're saying 3. And the next person says 3, 3, 3, 3. And by the time it gets to you, 75% of the time, I think you said, we will say 3.
Yeah.
Even though we clearly know the answer is 2.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to distinguish. From what we can tell, none of them believed that the answer was what they just said. What they articulated was that in this context, they felt such discomfort at articulating a viewpoint that was different to the majority that they simply lied.
Yes.
But I think what's also important to keep in mind, even though this is a great study and a classic study, they weren't really motivated to do anything else. You know, if they say the correct answer, it's not like they got a prize. It's not like they got some kind of reward. And at the end of the day, it's lines. Whereas if they did give the correct answer, they would then have to feel this kind of discomfort.
Yes.
Of articulating a different view. And I think we all experience this, you know, even if you're going out for some food with a bunch of friends and you're thinking, okay, I'm in the UK, I need to have fish and chips. And everyone else in your group is saying, pizza, let's go pizza. The likelihood is you may well just go, okay, go with this.
Yeah. I mean, those Asch conformity experiments really demonstrate to me how many people in the world want to stop drinking, don't want to drink alcohol, hate the fact that they drink alcohol, but because their group that they've known, their colleagues, their family, their friends, society is all saying, let's drink alcohol, let's consume alcohol, they conform. 75% of us will go, okay, even though I know alcohol's not good for me, and even though I fundamentally want to live my life alcohol-free, because my societal group has made alcohol such an integral part of the group, I'm going to conform.
Yeah. I do think it's worth keeping in mind, though, in the Asch, there was a lack of motivation to do anything else.
Yeah.
Whereas I think for a lot of your listeners, the people we're chatting to now, it's not like that. You know, there is motivation. And so I think what becomes more important is to maybe view those signals, whether it's a kind of implicit or a more explicit influence, if you like, from others in a more objective way. Because there will be times maybe where someone is saying, okay, I am going to be judged in this context, but this is important to me and so it's worthwhile.
I want to bring up 3 more social experiments from 3 different psychologists. Ivan Pavlov conducted the experiment which came to be known as Pavlov's dogs. I would submit probably most people who aren't that familiar with psychology have probably at some time or another heard of Pavlov's dogs. Could you just explain that experiment And then I've got my own kind of hypothesis as to why people drink alcohol in certain situations based on that experiment.
Yeah, I mean, Pavlov wasn't a psychologist. He was a biologist with a keen and healthy fascination in dogs' digestive systems.
Okay.
And essentially what he did was to teach dogs to salivate in response to hearing a bell.
Yes.
Typically, dogs will salivate, as we humans do, when presented with food. You know, we were just talking about pizza, fish and chips. You're sitting there, you're looking at your plate of food. I say, no, hold back, 2 minutes, just stare, smell. You'll start to salivate. I will start to salivate. This automatically happens. Typically, if you ring a bell for a dog, it won't start to salivate. What Pavlov did very simply was paired food with the sound of a bell over and over and over and over again, so that an association built up to the point where he would ring a bell, the dog would salivate. And so what's being demonstrated here is the importance and the strength of associations. We associate things with each other, and you know, there are lots of experiences of this in life. It may be that on this trip to the UK, you've been listening to, I don't know, a particular album that's just been released, someone you really like. 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, you might listen to that again, and suddenly you're, oh yeah, that trip to Cambridge,
Yes.
suddenly I remember.
Taylor Swift. We'll talk about Taylor Swift.
Yeah,
The summer of 2024.
No, I know you're a big fan.
I'm a Swiftie. I'm actually wearing a Swiftie bracelet that my 12-year-old niece gave me when I took her to Wembley.
It's looking good.
Oh, thank you. Carry on, please. Yeah, the association.
Oh yeah, so the association. I mean, this is everywhere. So, you know, music, smell is a big one.
Yeah.
You know, if you smell the aftershave, cologne, whatever, of your, I don't know, your worst enemy at school or in a workplace or a former lover or something, we get these associations. And I think within the context of what you're talking about, it might be that people just build up associations. You know, it might be you get to a certain point in the day, and you have a drink.
Knock off time at work.
That's just what you do.
I finished work at 6 o'clock. It's time to go home. Pull the keys out, open the door, close the door, put the keys down. That associates with time to go to the fridge and pull out an alcoholic drink.
Yeah.
Maybe I would submit a champagne bottle. The sound of the cork popping elicits, cheers, and yes, and celebration. That's what's going on in this experiment, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly, and if that's your daily tipple, then, you know, the champagne corks go all over the place. I think in some ways, I know we're slightly off topic, but you can see how this applies maybe even more strongly with smoking behaviour. It might be that you know, someone is working and they get a break. People even refer to it as cigarette break. So you get a break from work, pleasure. What do you do in it? You smoke. So you're building that association. It's been researched quite heavily. You know, a lot of smokers, they have a meal, pleasure, food. Immediately they have a cigarette. And so in all sorts of ways, they're building up this association between pleasure and cigarettes. It might play out slightly differently with alcohol, but I think it's exactly the same dynamic.
Yeah. A lot of the times when our clients come to us, we have a stop drinking program called Project 90, and we help our clients to stop drinking for 90 days. We try to rewire their mindset, because their mindset has been that alcohol, for the most part, equals fun and pleasure, and alcohol free equals dull, boring, and feeling like they're in a prison. And a lot of the work that we do is trying to flip that mindset. I call it a flipperoonie. Do the flipperoonie, and we start to have the association of not drinking alcohol with pleasure and reward, and drinking alcohol with pain and suffering.
I mean, this is, I guess, one of the implications about behaviourist theories generally. The idea is that everything is learned. If we've learned to have this relationship with this, if we've learned to have this relationship with a person, with a thing, nothing is essential. And so everything that has been learned can be relearned.
Or unlearned.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a scene in Empire Strikes Back. I'm not sure if you're a Star Wars fan, but Yoda is training Luke Skywalker, and he keeps saying, "You must unlearn what you have learned."
Yeah. And I mean, these associations can be challenged, broken down. I mean, it's the core of behaviour modification therapy that's very often used to treat people with phobias. You either challenge the initial association and desensitize, or you could go down the route of counter conditioning. You try and replace associations. So these techniques, I think, on the one hand, are powerful. Behaviourist approaches, I think, are sometimes limited because what they, I guess, neglect or downplay is the decision-making agent, the self in the person. You know, associations are important, but it's not just about the association. It's how we make sense of the world, how we process our beliefs about what others are thinking, whether we're being judged, whether we're not being judged. How important is this to me? Am I just thinking, well, it's of crucial importance to me, so therefore it must be of crucial importance to you? So I think it's one layer.
Two more pretty famous experiments that were run. The Little Albert experiment by John B. Watson, where when a young boy was conditioned to fear a white rat. And then the Albert Bandura experiment, which was called the Bobo doll experiment, which illustrated the concept of observational learning and how children learn behaviours through the imitation of others. Could you talk to those two experiments and how that might relate to the topic of alcohol?
Sure. I mean, in many ways, the Little Albert study was Pavlov's dogs with a human child. Another textbook study. It's really, Watson was trying to, his motivation was to try and argue that psychology didn't need to think about the mind, that we can have a science of behaviour, and that is the way to go for psychology. And what he was really trying to do in that study was demonstrate that association, as demonstrated by Pavlov, the dog, salivation, it could be used to actually explain emotions in humans. And of course, what Watson did was really just set up a visual representation of a white fluffy creature of some sort, paired with an unpleasant noise, and of course little Albert developed a fear of
white rats,
white fluffy, essentially. Because the fear then generalized. And in some ways it reinforces what I was saying about Pavlov. These associations are important, they can be powerful, they can give rise to fear, but ultimately they can be broken down and relearned.
Which is encouraging for anyone who's really finding it challenging to stop drinking on their own, that they can unlearn what they've learned and they can learn new behaviours. So just because they grew up with an alcoholic mother or father demonstrating drinking behaviour, which they may have mirrored, ultimately this is an unlearnable skill. Or a learnable skill to choose to be alcohol free.
Or to have a different relationship. And I guess that takes us into the Bandura study, because in many ways Bandura was a behaviourist, but he was also a social psychologist. And he was saying, okay, yes, associations are important. He was also talking to the work of Skinner, looking at rewards and punishments. But he was saying, actually, we don't necessarily need to be rewarded and punished. Sometimes we just need to observe something going on, and that will shape our behaviour. And of course, in the Bobo doll study, it was simply a case of kids were shown a video where someone was playing violently with a toy. They were then put in a room with the toy, and guess what? They just started beating the hell out of it.
They started being violent themselves towards the toy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the same time, I guess you could say, well, look, you know, it's an inflatable thing with sand in the bottom. You know, what else are you supposed to do with it? Sit and drink tea and put your little finger in the air. But I do think it gets at something important, that we look to others for information. And in some ways, this is going right back to where we started. You know, the nature of social reality is ambiguous. Social referencing, looking to others for information, a lot of the time serves us well. If we're in a situation where I don't know what the right thing is to do here, I don't know how to behave, I've not been in, I don't know, a formal dinner at King's College, I've not been in, I don't know, a particular sporting event before, I don't want to look like a complete lunatic, how do I behave? We reference others and we allow them to shape our behaviour. But of course we don't do this completely blindly. You know, if I go into I don't know, a particular sporting event and it starts up and everyone starts just punching each other in the head, I might look around and go, okay, I don't really fancy this, I'm going to leave. It's not like I would just mindlessly start doing these things. So I think interesting study, but be aware of limitations.
Yeah. De-individuation. A greater emphasis on the group than their own individuality.
Yeah.
Are we individuals who make choices for ourselves, or are we individuals who make choices because of the group dynamic? Maybe just explain de-individuation and was it Foster, 1952? What was the name of the...
Festinger.
Festinger.
Yes.
Festinger, 1952, de-individuation.
Bad note-taking, student. De-individuation, I guess, is a concept that was devised to try and understand the relationship between the individual and the social group. Whether it's a small social group or whether it's a crowd. And it was really looking at essentially the extent to which we feel like an individual versus on the other end of what might be regarded as a continuum, the extent to which we feel submerged within a group. So looking at different concepts or factors such as anonymity, suggestibility, and also actually alcohol intake, drugs are seen as one of those factors that which makes us more de-individuated. So it's really a way of looking at the interaction between the individual and the kind of group setting.
What keeps coming up for me in this work is how easily influenced we are by the group. And that's certainly the challenge that many of our stop drinking clients and members face. They are finding it very challenging to, I guess, hold their ground or to express their individuality, to be alcohol free in the face of a society that just glorifies the lifestyle that they actually don't want. So I'm not sure I have a question rather than it's just an observation.
Yeah. I think, and I'm going to probably start repeating myself a little bit here, but I think it's worthwhile remembering that for anyone deciding I'm going to change my relationship with alcohol, or with someone saying I'm going to stop smoking, or the person over there at the dinner party earlier who wants to change his or her relationship with food. In their head, for them, that is a level 10 importance issue. And I think it's worthwhile remembering, you know, I take on board what you just said, but in any kind of social situation, it may well not be the case that this is even a level 5
Yes.
or even a level 4 in the mind of another.
Yes.
But of course, we're motivated. We are, to an extent, egocentric and narcissistic, and we think, well, what matters to me, what's important to you, may well be important to you. And I know I'm repeating myself, we are easily skewed because of the nature of social influence, the nature of social reality, and the nature of non-verbal signals between us.
We are heading for home here. I've got some questions from our leadership program members. The leadership are folks who have been at least 1 year alcohol-free. They're very interested in science and living the best lives that they can. And they sent me through some questions to ask you. So we'll just do these kind of somewhat quick fire, and some of them, it may sound like that you're having to repeat yourself because we may have already touched on it. But here we go. Okay, so why do people find it important to seek other people's approval?
I guess it links back into things that we've talked about. The social referencing, could even talk about the Asch study. I mean, one thing that we didn't talk about with the Asch study is that conformity was reduced even if just one of those participants over there who answered before you gave an equally wrong answer. And so it's like a little bit of social support from the environment can help us in that kind of situation. And that's why I think it becomes valuable to seek others, to seek like-minded people. And I think that's probably why, what you do is so valuable, because it's giving that social support to others.
Yeah.
And saying, I'm not the only one.
Yeah. Social support is huge. How can social support networks influence someone's decision to stop drinking? I think we just pretty much answered that, but I'll ask it anyway. How can social support networks influence someone's decision to stop drinking?
I mean, I guess from my perspective, the importance comes after the decision. It might be that if someone is considering making a choice, making a change, then the support network can be useful in terms of how to go about making this decision. Why am I doing it? Am I just complying to kind of pressure? Is it about me? Do I want this? So I think the networks can help people process and then become even more valuable maybe after a decision is made.
What role does self-identity play in the decision to become alcohol-free?
Yeah, I guess identity is an important thing. For some people, and again, we're not talking categories here. I think we're talking probably dimensions. I think there's a difference between maybe someone who drinks and someone who sees themselves as a drinker. There's a shift in terms of whether this activity has become a more central part of their identity. And obviously I think if someone, for whatever reason, in whatever way, they have a certain relationship with alcohol that has become an important part of their identity, then if they want to alter that, it's going to be different from someone who just, I'm a taxi driver, I'm a tree surgeon, I'm this, that and the other, and I happen to drink now and again. And so it's useful to understand, I think, this dynamic, to understand what role alcohol might play in a person's life and sense of identity.
What impact does social media have on perceptions of drinking and sobriety?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those sources of the norms, which which surround us. Or if you want to put your Freudian glasses back on, it's one of those things that feeds into the shape of the superego. So it does play a role. And it might be that certain things are conveyed, whether it's in social media, whether it's in film, whether it's in literature. But I think it's always worthwhile bearing in mind that these things are not one-dimensional. There are many different expressions, and ultimately what you see in media or in film or whatever is representative of a group, not necessarily everyone.
Yeah. Can you discuss the psychological benefits of choosing to live alcohol-free? Psychological benefits through the lens of your 3 decades of research.
I'm not sure about psychological benefits. I mean, research suggests that there are lots of medical benefits. And I think if someone is going down a path of thinking, I want to change my relationship with alcohol, or maybe they've been told by their GP, their doctor, you need to change your relationship with alcohol, then ultimately this is going to give rise to some kind of potential conflict or some unease. And so if someone successfully changes their relationship with alcohol, then, and also I think gets a better understanding of non-verbal communication, the way in which signals can easily be misinterpreted, I think ultimately they can become more at ease with their decision and where they are, and that's where the psychological benefits probably come.
We've been talking to Professor Johnny Lawson, Fellow in Psychology and Behavioural Science at Girton College here at the University of Cambridge, and also a Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Oxford Brookes University. Just to wrap things up, Professor Lawson, we've covered a lot of different psychologists and theories, and we've looked at experiments. I'm trying to determine if there is one overarching lesson that comes out of this for someone who is desiring to live an alcohol-free lifestyle but is finding it challenging. Is there something, is it a bumper sticker? Is there a final kind of thought or big dramatic drum roll piece of insight that might support someone like that?
I mean, I guess it depends on why they're finding it challenging. There might be a whole bunch of things inside. We've spoken about habits, associations, addiction itself has a biological, physical aspect to it. And those are all going to be challenges that need to be dealt with. I guess my advice would be, don't go making things even harder for yourself by erroneously dragging in a whole bunch of social pressure as well. It might be that what you're doing is challenging, and so I think one way in which you can help yourself is to try and simplify, and to question yourself. If you're in this environment and you think someone is judging you because you've got a soda water or whatever, think of the example that I talked about with the photos of a particular person, or think about someone walking into the supermarket and kind of projecting their fear into the heads of total strangers, and try and step back and be aware of the extent to which non-verbal communication, the signals that we send to each other, are ambiguous, and it doesn't take much motivation to really skew what we think we're perceiving, and in doing that we're just adding to the pressure.
Professor Lawson, thank you so much for your time.
A pleasure.
Yes, from the University of Cambridge here in the United Kingdom, thank you so much for joining us.